Okay, now these are fresh sealing rings right here. This is part of the kit. And as you can see, I have my axial and radial Torrington bearings. This is going to be the hub that the sprag clutch bears against. Now, this is a brake, because what I'm going to do when I apply this piston, I'm going to be locking the sun gear to the case. And when I apply this piston, I'm going to be able to connect the sun gear to the turbine shaft. Now I've put just a little assembly lube there on the bore, and I actually had already test fitted it and lined up the clutches underneath. That's why it fell together so nicely. So there we go. Now we can do a quick air check. Okay, here we're doing a quick air check, and as you can see, absolutely no leakage on the brake. Now when I come across those scarf cut Teflon sealing rings there on the stator support, it's that I'm going to get a little bit of leakage, and then of course I'll be applying air pressure there to the piston cavity, and as we can see, that's working very nicely. So very good. And of course I'm going back with the original plates. One thing you have to be a little bit careful of, if we make this too tight, it can cause kind of a bump feel there when the transmission shifts. If it's too loose, then of course the piston's getting close to the end of its travel, and I'm not able to effectively apply the clutch. So this should be good, and we're ready to continue on. Okay, now here we're moving to the K2 drum. First thing I'm going to do is remove this snap ring so I can remove this internal gear. Now one thing on the 722.6, be careful, because if I were to compare this transmission with some of the other units for like a 4-cylinder or V6 application, this transmission has considerably stockier parts and has a very different tooth count. So we want to be sensitive to that. Okay, here we see the K2 drum. Here's our Torrington bearing. As we can see, this is a 4-planet carrier. This would be for a V8 application. Now we'll go ahead and remove our snap ring. Now, anytime you work on an automatic transmission, the first thing you want to do is look at the pan. If the pan is clean and free of metal, and it's kind of a testimony that the transmission is in good shape. In fact, we can see just how good a shape it is because I can still see the part number, the Mercedes part number on the clutches. So it'd be kind of a waste to try and put a banner kit in this. These clutches are in excellent condition. Now, as part of the refresh right here, I need to replace the rubber seals here on my release piston and my apply piston. Now, obviously with my tool set somewhat limited here on this K2 drum, it's not going to be straightforward to how to do that. There, I'm kind of looking at the directions, and that's not one that's included. So here I'm going to be taking it over to the arbor press. Now I could use these fixtures to push it down, but I actually have something already. Okay, now this is an arbor press. These are available from Northern and Harbor Freight. Witt sells a nice one that's specific for automatic transmissions. This one actually is an old one that was given to me by my transmission shop because they bought a new one. But what I'm doing is I just simply use a bolt to lock it down. Remember that I am applying force with my hand there with this pinion and rack style mechanism. So I'm not putting a lot of force on this, and I'm using my hands, so I have direct feedback. And I just simply use a set of my favorite snap-on snap ring pliers, and And that snap ring comes right off. Simply loosen the bolt. And we're ready to go back to the bench. Okay, now as we look here, this is the lube passage right here. And here's the passage to apply that K2 clutch. And so that blasts the piston right out without any problem. One thing that I like to do is if there's a lot of transmission fluid in there, I like to just take an initial wipe before I take it over to the solvent tank, because I'm trying to reduce the volume of transmission fluid that's introduced to the solvent, that's all. But we're going to be replacing the O-ring. And what I'm doing is I'm just popping off the old O-rings. I'll take it over to the safety clean solvent tank, wash it up real good, and bring it right back. Okay, now this is a lease safety clean solvent tank. I'm using 105 solvent. They come and clean it every 3 months, every 90 days. And I actually have 2 of them, and the reason why I have 2, I was going to have one that was dirty and one that was clean, but what I ended up doing is just using one, and as I lost coolant, or I should say lost solvent, through using it, I make it up from the other one. Now, when the solvent gets real dirty, I'm using these from Northern Hydraulics. They have these solvent cleanup bags, and what it is a big bag. It's rather heavy. Filled what looks like kitty litter, and after using it with the solvent will actually go clear, and that seems to work out real well, depending upon how many transmissions I'm doing and what kind of condition they're in. Now, one thing that's really important when using this solvent, it's not really toxic per se, but if you were to use your bare hands in it for any period of time, it has a tendency to wash all the oil out of your hands. And some people kind of react negatively to it. So it makes common sense that you ought to wear a set of gloves. And these are just the nitrile mechanics gloves, available from my local Advance Auto Parts. Now, during the wash process, you also want to inspect. So you're looking at critical bearing surfaces, kind of expecting a condition of the internal gear and a condition of the surface that the Torrington bearing bears against. If I have any bushings, I want to go ahead and inspect that bushing surface and the bushing itself. And again, a clue, if you're looking at the pan of the automatic transmission as you're taking it apart and it's full of metal and material, then you know something is coming apart. But if it's clean, then you got a good solid unit. All right, so now we'll go ahead and blow dry it and put it back on the assembly bench. Okay, now we've removed our old O-rings, and this is our new O-ring kit. And again, as you look at it, you're going to have a combination of a D-type O-ring and just regular conventional O-rings. Now this D-type O-ring is going to mount here in the drum. Now as far as kind of washing the drum and solvent and air drying it, well, that's a nice thing to do. And you're probably asking, is that absolutely necessary? Well, I guess not. It's just that what I'm trying to do is kind of clean out some of the metal paste and just do a good job of inspection. If you didn't have a solvent tank and you didn't have a way to clean your parts, well, then you could just carefully inspect them the best you can. And when wiping parts in an automatic transmission, obviously you have that Dacron style filter. So if you had fibrous rags that were putting fiber all through the transmission, well, as long as it didn't get in the valve body it would be nicely captured by the filter. Okay, so here's that first O-ring, or D-type ring I should say. And then what happens is I have the return piston and the apply piston, and I can clearly see that the apply piston is just a little bit bigger than the return piston. So here's my slightly larger O-ring. You'll notice it just kind of slides right on there. And of course, when you're assembling this, if it slipped off for any reason, you'd know it, because there it would fail the air check. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and use a little of the assembly lube and drop our pistons into position. Okay, so here I've loaded up my O-ring, D-type ring. It's really no problem with this style. It just drops right into position. Here we have our return spring, and this is going to be the release piston. And we can see the witness mark where the diaphragm spring bears against the release piston. Just very gently kind of push her down into position. Fresh O-ring slides right in there. Now obviously I got to push this down with the arbor press and then slip this snap ring into the groove. Okay, here we're using the arbor press again, very nicely. Simply compresses the spring. And here we have our actually wire type snap ring, and you can pretty well put it in by hand. I think, there we go. It's right in the groove without any problem. Go ahead and release it. No problem. Now, these are Torlon sealing rings, and they actually last very nicely. They're not really a problem. And some builders, they kind of hold off and say, hey, you know, why should I threaten a good thing? But I do get brand new ones in the Toledo kit. And of course, obviously, the gentleman is paying for a full kit, so we try to put the full kit in. Now, sealing rings, the hook type metal sealing rings of old, and then of course the scarf cut kind of Teflon sealing rings, and then finally these Torlon sealing rings. These have come a long way, kind of the history of automatic transmissions. So here we're kind of seeing the pinnacle right here. These actually pretty well last the life of the unit and work very nicely. Also, it's kind of hard to mess them up putting it together. Okay, here are the new Torlon sealing rings, and here we just simply slip them into their groove. And of course, obviously, if you have 3 of them, make sure you put 3 back. On some models, you may have 4 or more. Make sure that there is a proper size Torlon sealing ring in each of the corresponding grooves. And there we go. Brand new, ready to go back. So we replaced our sealing rings, we replaced the rubber on the clutches. Now we're going to go ahead and use the original clutches, which are in excellent condition. And again, as we go back with the apply plate, they like to use the spring type apply plate. It's dished. You'll notice the witness mark that shows where it goes down against the piston. And then here, I'm using my conventional style plates. Here we have a steel and then a double-sided friction. And as we can see, there's certainly no problem with this transmission. It wasn't slipping. It was probably working very nicely. Now, to us, this is actually a bench job. I haven't seen the vehicle, and it may be they're doing some major renovation to the vehicle and wanted the transmission freshened. So that's what's taking place. Okay, here we're ready to install the snap ring, and the witness mark clearly bears which side was up and down. Doesn't really make any difference, but I'm just putting it back the way it was. And here I see the clearance, and this is the clearance that I had operated with. If we make it too tight, as we mentioned, it has a tendency to bump into gear. If it's too loose, well then, of course, obviously the piston's getting close to the end of its travel. Now with the Mercedes 722.6, the 722.9, and the 725.0, remember that I have a transmission control module that's controlling line pressure and the apply pressure to the individual friction elements. And so what it's doing is it's actually learning the duty cycle and the rate that it has to apply a piston by controlling the solenoid to apply it with the desirable shift. And remember, this is varies extremely. Like obviously if I'm accelerating at very slow rate in comfort mode, I want a totally imperceptible shift. But there, if I'm accelerating hard in the sport mode, I want a good positive shift. All right, here we see the Torrington radial bearing here within the lubrication passage, and this is of course the input shaft, and there is going to be the output shaft. This, of course, we'll be inspecting that, and this is a surface there that I'm going to have a axial Torrington bearing. All right, now this is my forward Planetary. Now this has 4 planet pinions. I want to make sure that they spin freely, no excessive play, nice and quiet. There's no problem here whatsoever. Here I have one of my axial Torrington bearings. Here I see my other Torrington bearing. Now these are actually retained. They can be popped out, but they are retained. Now many manufacturers, not only Mercedes, but I have to have a plan for lubrication. So here what happens is I have actually a centrifugal type of oil capture that's actually going to capture lubricating oil, that is transmission fluid, and send it down the hollow shaft of a planet pinion. And there's a hole in the shaft that then distributes transmission fluid to the needle bearings. And if I actually press this out, you'll notice the way this is designed is that the hole is usually on the outboard side. So their centrifugal force kind of helps me not only direct fluid into this section, but also distribute it out through the bearings between the inner shaft and then, of course, the gear. So here these gears are supported on needle bearings. Every one of them is turning very quietly and smoothly, so we have no problems at all. Now on some of these Torrington bearings I'll have a race, but this one does not. The Torrington bearing bears directly against the surface. So we'll go ahead and carefully set this in position. Here we see our internal gear. Here we see the snap ring, and again the witness mark kind of shows me where it was. I'm going to put it back. Now, not on this model, but on some models there'll be a kind of locator that will determine how you put the snap ring in. Now, I don't have that. I can put the snap ring in any 360-degree position, so I don't have to worry about that with a Mercedes, but on some models you'll see that. Not a Mercedes, though. Okay, now we're ready to move over and go ahead and set it on the pump. Okay, what I've done is I've lubricated this section right here that the Torrington seals are going to ride in. Now, one thing that's interesting about a Planetary gear train is that the planet pinions are going to actually support this member against the internal gear. So I don't have any type of bushing here. That will never be any contact. I do want to provide just a little lubricant just to help the new Torlon seals go into position. Now, sometimes what happens, you need to kind of line these clutches up, but usually the Mercedes is pretty cooperative, so I should be able to just drop her down and get it to line properly. And that was very easy. And let me show you what I mean. Here, all of the plates have come into alignment, and I was able to solidly go right down onto the Torrington bearing. No problem.